How to learn a language. Hello, friends. I hope you all are well. Today, in this video, I'm going to tell about the process of learning new languages. Learn new languages not hard, but its need to tricks. Today's episode is something different from usual. Today, I'm going to tell you my process for writing an episode of Easy Stories in English. A process is the way something is done. I'm going to tell you my process for making the podcast and the best way to learn a language in general. Why? Well, I realized that I have thought a lot about the theory behind the podcast, but I have never shared it with you listeners. Hopefully, this episode will help you better understand how to study languages, and if you are a language teacher, how to teach better. Around the time I first started the podcast, I was reading a lot of research about second language acquisition. A second language is a language that you learn after your first language, your native language. So my first language, for example, is English, and French is my second language. Technically, you can have third, fourth, fifth languages and so on, but we often use second language to talk about all languages you learn after your first. Acquisition means acquiring, getting something. In this context, it means learning. So, second language acquisition is the study of how we learn languages. You might be thinking, why do you use the word acquisition then? Why not just say second language learning? Well, that's because we learn languages in a different way to other things. Usually, when we hear the word learning, we think of reading books, studying, and memorization. Memorize means to make yourself remember something. For example, when my parents were at school, they had to memorize poems so that they could say the poems without reading them off the page. But languages are not like that. You can't just memorize all the parts of a language. This is because the skill to acquire a language is innate. When something is innate, it means we have it from birth. We aren't born speaking a language, but everyone is born able to acquire one. So we know that language acquisition is an innate process. We listen to the language around us. People communicate with us, and so we acquire our first language. How we acquire our first language hasn't really changed much in human history because it works. What doesn't work so well is language teaching, at least for most people. Think of your language classes at school. How many students spoke the language well after years of classes? How many students continued to learn after leaving school? Language teaching is mostly still the same as in Roman times. For thousands of years, we've understood that there is a list of grammar rules that you learn, then you fill in the gaps with vocabulary, and bam, you're speaking a language, except that doesn't usually happen, does it? Now, some of you might have enjoyed this way of teaching. Some people have brains that understand grammar very well. I'm one of those annoying people myself. But you probably still studied English for years without feeling like you could actually speak it. In the 1970s, a linguist called Stephen Krashen had a hypothesis. A hypothesis is an idea in science that someone is trying to prove. For example, there is a famous story about Isaac Newton. Apparently, an apple fell on Isaac Newton's head, and that inspired him to create a hypothesis. His hypothesis was that things are pulled towards the earth, the ground. This hypothesis became the theory of gravity. Stephen Krashen's hypothesis was this: we learn languages by communicating and understanding messages. He called this the theory of comprehensible input. Comprehensible means easy to understand, and input is information that you put into something. For example, When you press a button on your computer, that is input. It tells the computer to do something. When I speak into the microphone, that is also input. The microphone uses sound as input and records it. Stephen Krashen believed that we acquire language by receiving input, reading and listening, that is comprehensible, easy to understand. In other words, we learn language when people speak to us in a way we can understand. When we read books, we can understand. When we listen to podcasts, we can understand. Maybe like this one, and so on. In one of his talks, Stephen Krashen gives an example of an experience that inspired his theory. He was working as director of English as a second language at a university in New York in the 1970s. Next door to his apartment lived a family who had recently moved from Japan. So, of course, he tried teaching English to one of the children, a 4-year-old girl called Hitomi. How did he do this? He encouraged Hitomi to practice speaking. First, he told her phrases to say, "Do you like that ball?" But she said nothing. Next, he gave her the words to say, "Ball, say ball." She said nothing. So then he broke down the words into individual sounds. Bu-a-lu-lu. Ball. Still, she said nothing. He tried making a deal with her, making an agreement with her, saying things like, "I won't give you the ball until you say the word ball." By now, you can probably guess that this didn't work. Then, 5 months later, Hitomi started to speak. By the end of the year, Hitomi could speak almost as well as the other kids her age in the neighborhood. So, what happened? In those 5 months when Hitomi was silent, it seemed like she wasn't learning. But she was. She was listening. She was understanding things in context. She was acquiring language through comprehensible input. Now you may be thinking, hey, I spend lots of time watching TV shows in English, and it's taken me a lot longer than 5 months to be able to speak. Well, think of it this way. In those 5 months that Hitomi was in New York, she was surrounded by English all day, every day. And because she was a child, people would be trying to make abstract, then this doesn't make sense. Since Krashen's original theory, research has shown that this idea is true and that actually there is a natural order for many parts of language. This is sometimes called ordered development. The order can change a bit depending on your native language, but it mostly stays the same. Finally, Stephen Krashen's fifth hypothesis is the affective filter hypothesis. Affective with an A means related to feelings or emotions. A filter is something that you use to keep some things out but take some things in. For example, you might use an air filter to keep some things in the air, like oxygen. Oxygen is very important for us to live, but to take out things like dead skin and pollen, which make the quality of the air worse. The affective filter hypothesis states that when a learner has negative emotions, bad feelings, like anxiety, nervousness, or boredom, the negative emotions create a filter which makes acquiring language harder. If you're having fun while learning English and you feel relaxed, you're going to understand a lot more of the language. But if you're bored, hungry, or scared that you'll say something wrong, you'll understand less language. Those negative emotions create a filter that stops the language from coming in. Therefore, it is very important for language classes and language resources to create positive feelings. Correcting students for making mistakes, in my experience, mainly creates negative emotions. And over time, students can build up a strong, affective filter. I've had students who are so nervous that as soon as they don't understand one word, they panic, they get anxious, and then they cannot understand anything. So, these are the 5 hypotheses that make up Stephen Krashen's theory of comprehensible input. I'll just remind you of what they are. Then we'll take a break, and when we come back, I'll explain how I use them to make easy stories in English. The 5 hypotheses are: the input hypothesis, that we acquire language best when it is just a bit above our current level, or 1 + 1. The acquisition learning hypothesis, that subconsciously acquired language and consciously learned language are separate, and improvement comes only from acquisition. The monitor hypothesis, that consciously learned language can only be used to monitor our output, our speaking and writing, and not to actually speak and write. The natural order hypothesis, that all learners acquire language in a certain order, and the affective filter hypothesis, that negative emotions can create a filter which makes acquiring language harder. That was a lot, huh? Your brain must be hurting now. So let's take another break. You could even go and sleep for a bit, or come back to this episode another day. Don't worry, I'll still be here.